Great to see you all. We are talking about the church in Thyatira today. So if you open your Bibles to Revelation chapter 2 specifically, we're going to be looking at verses 18 through 29. Verses 18 through 29 is where we'll be reading. I want to start with a little bit of background. Maybe a background that you don't know about. This was a background that was slightly before my time, but one that I became familiar with because I learned from the past. And I really like to have the past inform my decisions. Who is this gentleman right here? Does anyone know? Jim Jones. Sorry? That's right. That's Jim Jones. Now, Jim Jones is famous for one thing that was maybe infamous for one thing, and that is, what did he get his church to do? Drink the Kool-Aid. That's where, if you've ever heard, okay, so if you've ever heard the famous saying, oh, hey, you know what, I drank the Kool-Aid, right? And I'm not trying to be morbid here. This is very serious. Many people lost their lives, but Jim Jones was a pastor who was extremely influential. But before he had his congregation drink Kool-Aid laced with poison so that they would die, he was an incredibly influential minister. He ministered in San Francisco, and this was before San Francisco is the San Francisco that we know today. And in the Bay Area, he had a church of over 20,000 people. Now, this is before the advent of mega churches. So he had like the mega church back in the day. He, of course, preached with sunglasses, which is super odd. I don't understand why people would do that, but no. But he did, in addition to his very influential preaching, which was very dynamic and very, you know, it captured a lot of people's imagination. He was someone who was very involved in the community. San Francisco being a big town, a big city, had many social problems. And he was someone who would reach out to the community in several different ways. They had a food pantry. In addition to that, they would do community projects. In addition to that, they would raise money for causes, help kids to learn how to read in the inner city. I mean, in short, it was just a really great church on the outside. He was, of course, a very dynamic man. He received a lot of community awards because of that dynamism. He always surrounded himself and took great opportunities to do kind of PR things so that people would see just how inclusive he was. And this is one of my favorite pictures that I found. This is Jim Jones with our former governor, Jerry Brown. There were pictures of him with Dianne Feinstein. There were pictures of him with many prominent California leaders because, after all, this was the biggest church in California at the time, and they showered him with gifts. I mean, in addition to that, Jim Jones his church was People's Temple, and it was in good standing with a denomination that was at least somewhat reputable. That is, the Disciples of Christ. But then things started getting weird. Jim Jones started to justify his promiscuity, and his sexual vices, you know, just kind of became kind of like, well, I mean, I have needs, and these are my needs, and so I'm going to go for them. Because he was so influential, his church of 20,000, he convinced almost 1,000 people to move with him to a place called Jamestown. Jamestown was in Guyana. And it was a place where, once he started getting very kind of off the wall, he moved from the United States, from San Francisco, to this place in Guyana, which was supposed to be a utopia. If you've ever heard the word utopia, it basically means that all things are set right on earth, that it's, you know, kind of the perfected vision of the way that things could be. He claimed to hear the voice of God directly. And as a result of that, he took all these people down to Jamestown, and he had them do public projects. He wanted to help the poor people in that country by putting on just tremendous building projects and doing all kinds of things for the community. He worked with a lot of folks that, again, would teach people to read. He did all these amazing things, but the thing that he's most famous for is having his congregation drink a poisoned laced punch. And interestingly enough, and I don't know if you can see it very well in this picture. I apologize that it's a little bit smaller than I would like it, but at the very top it says, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And that's the pulpit where he taught his very final message before he and his lieutenants distributed the Kool-Aid. You know, this was a church that on the outside seemed to have all the trappings of health. I mean, they were dynamic. They had success. They were reputable within the community. And they did things for the community. But along the line, something went very, very wrong. And it went wrong internally, not just with the leader, because 1,000 of the people in the church went with him. And although not all of them died, many of them did end up engaging in this. And so we're going to look at the church today in Thyatira because this church is eerily similar, because it's a church that's starting to get a little bit toxic. It's a church that's starting to get a little bit mixed up. It's a church that's stopping thinking about the love, or the power of love, and it's starting, at least its leaders, seemingly to think about the love of power. And so let's read verse 18 of chapter 2 of the book of Revelation. It says, "To the angel of the church in Thyatira write these things." Now let's just stop there. We're looking, of course, this is the fourth of our 7 churches that we're going to be looking at. And this here, again, is the map of the 7 churches in Asia Minor. And Thyatira, let's go ahead and look at like a city profile, because that's what we've been doing every time. Because again, Revelation is a book of symbols, and these symbols are embedded and were understood by the recipients to whom John wrote, right? So like the church in Sardis had unique things that wasn't true of the church in Thyatira, and Pergamum had certain things. And so Thyatira is a very interesting thing because it was at the crossroads of many different trade routes. Thyatira was famous for their labor. And I know that sounds kind of funny. If you look at Thyatira now, some of these ruins are very interesting, not for what they have, but for what they don't have. If you've been tracking with me for the previous weeks that we've been doing this, I always try to show you pictures of big, magnificent buildings, amphitheaters, and temples. And although the church in Thyatira, or the city of Thyatira, had temples, they did not have any of the sort of trappings of the other cities that Sardis and Philadelphia, Laodicea, and Ephesus had. That is to say, they didn't have those things that were, sort of for kicking back and relaxing. Like they didn't have a place for Olympic Games. They didn't have big museums. They didn't have big libraries. Why? Because what the Thyatira city was all about, what the inhabitants were all about, was working. They were busy bees, man. They were getting to work. And what we have ruins of, interestingly enough, are trade guilds. Like, in other words, like to contemporize it, like union halls. Are you following what I mean? Like, they were so concerned with work. They were so obsessed with their labor that what we find, the archaeologists and the anthropologists and sociologists, what they find is like excavations of places where people would labor. They loved it. They worshipped it. In fact, on their coins, remember in some of the other cities, on the coins, they had inscriptions of the gods or goddesses. Well, on their coin, and this is just to try to like kind of illustrate it a little bit more to bring it out, this is a picture of a laborer, specifically a bronze worker, forming or forging a helmet for the goddess Athena. Isn't that interesting? So again, in the other cities, where the other cities might have had the vice of like sexual sin, right? They would, kind of worship sexuality, or the other churches would worship power and have swords, on their, what they had was like people doing work. I mean, this is eerily similar to the way that we are and were in America, right? America's the business of America is business, right? Like, we're an industrious people. We have achieved a tremendous amount. And so in that way, Thyatira was really similar to the way, like, our mentality is in America. Like, if we could go back to any one of the 7 cities that we're studying in the book of Revelation, like, we'd all have, like, cultural hurdles to overcome in order to understand them. But Thyatira would probably be the most like the United States, and the sensibilities of the Western individualistic worker bee like syndrome that we have, they would understand that and be like, oh yeah, that's us too. Because what they are, like what they venerated was work. And that's what we venerate today too. But see, one thing that's very interesting about the church in Thyatira as well is that there wasn't a huge amount of persecution there. Whereas there was a lot of persecution in other cities, right? Where there was, Ephesus, for instance, was the seat of the worship of the emperor, right? That's where the emperor worship really started to build up steam. And people were pressured and eventually persecuted if they didn't venerate the genius of the emperor by lighting a votive candle and getting what's called the mark, because they worshipped someone who was called the beast, interestingly enough. Whereas that is true of other cities, Thyatira doesn't show any pronounced kind of persecution against Christians. And nevertheless, a church without persecution is probably the most off church that we have the opportunity to study. Isn't that interesting? So again, how much persecution have we sustained in America?
Very little.
Yeah, like very little, like next to none, right? I mean, you can go if you're brave enough and you have the intestinal fortitude to be able to look at some of the examples of what our Christian brothers and sisters have to go through in countries where they're beheaded for their faith. Like, I don't feel so bad when someone says, "Happy holidays." I'm not like, persecuted. I need to say Merry Christmas. It would probably put us in check a little bit. Thyatira didn't have a lot of persecution, and nevertheless, they were the ones who were most tempted to go into toxicity, because when Jesus writes to them, he says something that we can really take to the bank. So let's read on in verse 18. So Jesus, the angel of the church in Thyatira, write these things. Jesus says, "The words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze." Isn't it interesting? A bronze worker forging a bronze helmet for the goddess Athena. In other words, these symbols would have immediately been recognized. He says this in verse 19, "I know your works, your love and your faith and your service and your patient endurance." Now that word there in Greek, patient endurance, is very interesting because it's sort of like your grit, your tenacity. You don't use words like grit and tenacity to explain someone who's a couch potato, right? You use it to explain someone who's like, on fire, right? Like they're working all the time. They're getting after it. That was the church in Thyatira, right? "And your latter words," Jesus says, "exceed the first." So Jesus always starts with praise, right? He always does thumbs up and then he does thumbs down. Verse 20, "But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols." Okay, let's stop there, because there's a truckload of meaning that we're going to have to try to unpack in this very significant kind of message. So if we could reduce it to like one thing that Jesus wants to communicate to the church in Thyatira. I almost said the church in Thyatira. Let's get these things right, okay? If he could communicate one thing, it would be this. Ready? Be discerning. If there's one thing that he wants to try to get across to the church, it's that, hey, you've got to be a little bit more discerning. And so the question has to be asked, how do we have discernment in an age of compromise? And so I think, number one, if we're going to have discernment in our world, we have to sort of define our terms. What do we mean by discernment? And I just got to tell you, if there's one thing that it really troubles me with the way that I think that I was raised and the way in the tradition that I was raised in, and even the Western church as a whole, it's that people aren't taught to have discernment. People are taught to maybe memorize things and to be able to regurgitate those things, but people aren't taught theology in real life. That's why I'm burdened to do this Thursday night class, which, by the way, is a shameless plug for that. It has nothing to do with how good, the class is going to be. It has to do with how good the material is that I'm going to be covering. It's really good stuff. And so I invite you to that, commend you, to it. But here's the thing. Discernment is the ability to say, I don't know about that. So when you're discerning, you're able to sift. And what we mean by sift is we're able to separate, the wheat from the chaff, or the good stuff from the bad stuff. To put it in like sort of a crass way, it's almost like this. Like, have you ever heard the expression, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like, that idiom sort of speaks to discernment. And I just want to say, like, we're taught so much to think about, like, okay, if it's branded with a fish, it has to be good. But if it has a cross on it, it has to be good. But like, if it's secular, it's bad. And I really want to challenge us on this. I really want to say, there are some so-called Christian teachings that are so harmful for Christians that I'll say, avoid this at all cost. Like, Jesus does not want you to, like, he did not die on the cross so that you could live your best life now. Jesus did not die on the cross so that a televangelist could have his own private jet. Jesus did not die on the cross so that you could eat apple pie and be happy all the time. Those kinds of messages that are ubiquitous in the Christian circle are actively harmful, because God does love you and he does have a plan for your life, but your plan might involve a little bit of getting roughed up. Likewise, there are some so-called secular things that will absolutely help you. Like, I don't know about you, but I'm always curious to find out what people think that pastors' lives are, and it's even more hilarious in the army, right? Because I literally, on my uniform, wear a cross, so people know, like, people will clean up their language around me. Like, old, salty sergeant majors will walk by, F this, F that, and I'm not trying to be crass, but, understand the culture, right? This is F it, oh, sorry, chap, how are you doing today? God is good all the time times God's good, and I'm like, Sergeant Major's fine, but it's really hilarious. So I don't know, I'm always interested to hear what people think my life is like, but I'm not, like, listening to the fish all day long. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not, like, in my car just being like, praise Jesus, in fact, sometimes, and please don't tell anyone this. You guys promise? Pinky promise? Sometimes I listen to secular music. Sometimes I watch ratings of movies above G. I know. Sometimes, no, I'm not going to go on. Anyways, but I say that not because, like, oh my goodness, I say that because it's like, sometimes the music that I listen to that's so-called secular is much better in terms of content than Christian music. There's some Christian music that's really bad. Like, not just terrible, like, done, like, this is really bad. Like, they should just go back to the studio or just burn all their stuff. They're terrible musicians. But there's some stuff that's like, the message is just harmful. So how do we not be like the people in Jamestown? How do we not be gullible? So eventually, like, we could be susceptible to the things that they were susceptible to. I think it's remembering and understanding some of these things that Jesus says. Here's the biggest thing. Number one, how do we be discerning? Don't think that you wouldn't fall for false teaching. The very fact that we think, you know what, it's fine. Like, I'm not listening to Jezebel. I'm not listening to Jim Jones. But be careful what you take in, because there's some so-called Christian teaching that is really bad. I would implore you to be careful about what television shows that you watch, because there are some television shows, and I won't say the network, but TBN is really bad sometimes. I'm serious. Be careful. Some shows are fine, but be discerning, because there's false teaching on there. There really is. And I know that it's not going to be a popular view, but please, brothers and sisters, be careful with what you're taking in. So Jesus commends them. I know your works of love, your faith, your patient endurance. He says, but I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess. What does he mean by Jezebel? Was it an actual woman? Did they actually sleep with her? Okay, let me just explain this. It was not an actual woman. So remember, first of all, the genre of the book of Revelation is the genre apocalypse. And in the genre apocalypse, you use signs and symbols to communicate truths. No one in the ancient world would have named their daughter Jezebel. The same reason that no one in the modern world would name their son, hey, this is my son, Adolf Hitler. Like, or Joseph Stalin, hello, Joseph, say hi. Like, no one would have done that. Why? Because they have such terrible reputations. Going back to the Old Testament, Jezebel was the wife of King Ahab. King Ahab was the king of Israel. And King Ahab, along with Jezebel, had been lured into worshiping the god and the goddess Baal and Ashereth. So these were gods and goddesses of human sacrifice, of vile sexual practices. I mean, these were just terrible people. Jezebel was not an actual person. And when it talks about, like, she sleeps with them, or, the church is sleeping with them, it's using that metaphorically. And the reason why I know that is because the book of Proverbs also uses that. The book of Proverbs is a little bit foreign to us Western readers. Instead of the author commending you to, like, learn wisdom, the book of Proverbs says, marry wisdom. Like, I wouldn't frame it like that, but then again, I'm American. I'm not, a Hebrew person. So the book of Proverbs says, stay away from the adulteress. Now, is that just to men? No, it's to women too, because there's two women. The way that the book of Proverbs is arranged is there's two women. There's one named Wisdom, and she's a personification of wisdom, right? Which is a big $5 word to just say it's wisdom in the sense that, like, you could almost touch it. You can't really, but you can almost touch it. It's the way that I talk about Lady Liberty, for instance. There's no such thing as Lady Liberty, but we all understand what we're talking about. Likewise, there's another woman, and you want to stay away from her. Her name is Folly. So which one are you going to marry? Which one are you going to spend time with? Which one are you going to adopt? Wisdom? If you do that, guess what? You'll be blessed. But if you do folly, guess what? You'll be cursed. In the same way, when it talks about, later on, we don't have time to read the whole thing, but in verse 21, it talks about her being, sexually immoral, and those who commit adultery with her, he's going to throw into the great tribulation. That's symbolic to indicate that Jezebel, or the spirit of Jezebel, was someone who said, hey, guess what? It doesn't matter what you do with your body, because it's not that big of a deal anyways. Let me explain. The trade guilds were a big deal in Thyatira. The trade guilds were everything. They provided a social safety net so that if you got into debt, the trade guilds would help you out. You couldn't just hang out your shingle if you were a bronze worker or an iron worker or a carpenter back in the day. You had to be a part of a guild. And along with being a part of the guild, you had to, contribute money toward it. And you also had to practice some of the immoral things that they would do. And a lot of them involved, because they would have patron gods or goddesses, a lot of them involved lascivious practices. Now, it's not the same with us today, so it takes a little bit of an understanding of a cultural barrier, or overcoming that cultural barrier to get this. But basically, the spirit of Jezebel is this. Hey, man, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's not that big of a deal. You got to do what you got to do to put food on the table. Like, if you have to go to the strip club with the boys after work, then you got to go to the strip club. It's not that big of a deal. And Jesus is saying, no, it is a big deal. You can't do that. Now, in the pastoral setting, this doesn't really apply to me that much because no one's pressuring me to do that. But in the chaplaincy setting, I have to remember this. Even though I do want to and I strive to be one of the guys, I also need to remember that I represent something different. So this applies to me in a special way, and I hope that it applies to you too. Don't ever compromise your beliefs out of a sense of economic fear. In other words, don't compromise what you believe and how you practice simply because you're scared that you'll lose your job. You tracking with me? So don't think this first point is that you wouldn't fall for wrong teaching, because they were subtly sucked into this idea that, Jezebel, it doesn't really matter what I do from 9 to 5, as long as on Sunday I'm in church. And I mean, goodness, how common is that belief? That's something that we need to be careful of. Don't believe that you wouldn't fall for false teaching, because it's very, very tempting. But also, don't believe everything that you hear. Don't believe everything that you hear. This is another way that you can practice and grow in discernment. It says in Revelation 20, the latter part, she, that is Jezebel, is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. Now, the big thing about the food sacrificed to idols, like this used to trip me up because, like, I don't know about you, but I would go to like certain ethnic restaurants, like, you know, Chinese food or whatever, and a lot of times they had like a Buddha outside, right? And I was like, oh boy, am I eating food sacrificed to idols? Like, I had this really tender conscience when I was a kid. Now it's just seared. So but like, I was like, man, am I like, you know, doing something wrong? The idea of food sacrificed to idols being tied to sexual immorality is very important because during these like lodge meetings or like during these union meetings, if you will, that what they would do is they would leave food out for the god or the goddess, and then they would eat it and practice sexual immorality. So I believe, and I'm not saying that that's like the definitive interpretation because I want to alert you that there are differences of opinion about this, and very good godly people do disagree. However, I've come to the conclusion, and several other commentators who are far smarter than me have come to the conclusion that these things are tied together, and it's not just about the food that you eat, it's the manner in which you eat them. So I hope that that makes sense. But don't believe everything that you hear. And this is really important because, you know, I can see some of your wheels turning. You're like, well, how do I know that you're legit, Michael? And I just want to say, you know, we actually have some Kool-Aid in the back. And but in all seriousness, brothers and sisters, the reason why we want to be so grounded in Scripture is that you can check your answers. You remember in math, show your work. Why do you show your work? So that, what's that? So you could get teachers? Someone said something about the teachers.
Know that you know what you're doing.
Exactly, but also so you could check your work, right? So this is so huge. And thank you for participating, by the way. I'm so glad. No, I'm serious. I'm not teasing you. Thank you, because we want active participation. Because if anyone's confused, I want them to be able to say, hey, time out. Wait, I'm not sure about this. But checking your work is important and making sure that you know why you arrived at a conclusion. Now, let's say this, okay? Let's say, hey, I have a burden from the Lord. I think that we need to do something for our first responders. Let's say that. I don't think any of us would say, hey, that's a heretical idea. But maybe some of you would say, well, I don't know that I'm convinced that we need to do anything for the first responders. I think that we should go, you know, and follow after doing something for our foster kids. And I could say, well, you know, we could do both, and I could maybe defend it from Scripture. But what about this? What about this? Ready? You know, I love being married to Sarah. I mean, we just had 15 years together, and God told me to get another wife. So, ladies, put in your applications. What if we did that? Okay, how could you call me out on that? In all honesty, and please, I'm sorry, I think of like these illustrations, I'm like, man, people are going to start throwing things at me, and you can, that's fine. But in all honesty, what could you do? What could you do to say, hey, Michael, I think that you just said you heard from God. I don't think you did. What's that? I'm sorry? Exactly. Well, but God told me, Aunt Jeannie. God told me. It's against Scripture. Thank you. So God's revelation, God can have a special word. This is where I want to be careful, okay? There's some people who believe that God's prophetic word to the church has ceased. That's a perfectly legitimate opinion. There's some people who believe that God's prophetic word to the church is still alive. That's a perfectly legitimate opinion. I tend to believe that it's still alive, but I do believe this. You better check it against Scripture. So that's a perfect example, and thank you to those of you who called me out, right? Why can I say I don't think that I should have another wife? Because it violates Scripture. So don't believe everything that you've heard from anyone, and that's not to say that you have to be critical and you have to be here, you know, doing notes and, you know, I think that this was just a dumb thing to say. If you have any of those complaints, send it to my email. robcheek@. No, I'm just kidding. That joke is getting a little old. However, I will take it to the grave with me. But seriously, don't believe everything that you hear. Doesn't mean that you have to be so skeptic that you're just mean and, you know, ornery. But it does mean that you need to be discerning. And you need to be like, wow, that was, okay, I've never thought about that. And one of my good friends, Dwayne, he's an amazing guy. He started coming to this church and he said, you know, I wanted you to know, I checked out what you had to say. I checked it against Scripture. And I said, you know what, thank you for that. Thank you for doing that. Because that's what Scripture says to do. The Bereans used to do that. The people in Acts, they would check what supposed apostles would say against what God has delivered in his word. This is special revelation, what we hold in our hands, and this is definitive, so that we know that anything that might come from the lips of a preacher that's not in here, they need to be corrected. But let's talk about some common signs of false teachers. Now, this is very like across the board. Common signs of false teacher, they love authority, don't they? Well, you see that in Jezebel. She steals authority and she says, you know what, I'm in charge here. But I've had some people who say, you cannot question what I have to say. And perhaps now is the time for me to explain sort of my stance on something. I don't love to be called Pastor Michael. Now, I've been called worse. So if you have to call me something, that's fine. But I prefer being called Michael because I was raised in a tradition where the first name of the pastor was not the first name. It was pastor. And it was a position of authority. And it meant that he was God's anointed. And that your job as a meagerly lowly layperson was simply to hold his hands up as he made tons and tons and tons of money and became increasingly out of touch with the community that he served. And I'm not being mean. I'm being serious. So whereas I understand that my role is a pastor, and I do take that seriously, I'm never going to be like, excuse me, can you call me Rev? Please call me Reverend. You know, I'm not going to do that because I grew up in a tradition where authority was abused. And it was abused in a really bad way. So, some common, and I'm not saying he was a false teacher, but man, they loved power. They loved it. And elders were just an obstacle to God's anointed, not the way that they could be, hearing God's voice. In addition to that, they're not correctable. And I would encourage you, there are some people who might veer off course. I was just reading Galatians for devotions. And in Galatians chapter 2, Paul has to correct Peter. Now, if you remember, Peter is like the cornerstone of the church. Like, he's a big deal. And Paul at a certain point is like, dude, I corrected that dude to his face. I was like, man, you stand condemned. And I could just imagine like Paul being like this short, in tradition, he's depicted as like a short, bald man. And Peter is depicted as this like big, like burly fisherman with like big forearms and stuff. I'm not kidding either. I could just imagine Paul being like, you shouldn't do that, But like Peter, he gets corrected. He's not like, I am the cornerstone, silence. He doesn't do that. Because he's not a false teacher. And he's not vulnerable to like, oh man, maybe I should really think about that. Some of you have come to me with legitimate, like, I'm just concerned about this. And I want to thank you for that. This church has just been so loving and so gracious. But it's also been like, hey, we got to get better at this. Or, hey, I see this. Is this, a possibility? And it's always been done with kindness and love. And I just appreciate that because I hope to be the kind of person who's correctable. And finally, the third common sign of false teachers, and this is so important for us to avoid, they claim secret knowledge or secretive. Kind of, hey, what's the fastest way in a church or in a group to spread something? By saying I have a secret, right? So you like, if you're like, hey man, I got a secret, but don't tell anyone. I mean, immediately the whole group knows, right? But the teaching being secretive, this is huge. This was afflicting and plaguing the early church. Now, we don't have time for us to really talk about this a ton, but in the book of Colossians, Paul actually addresses this. And he says basically this to the church in Colossae. He says, for in him, this is Colossians 1, verse 19, that is Jesus, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. That's because the church in Colossae, those people were tempted to believe that something called the pleroma, that's the Greek word for fullness, pleroma, allowed something for them to attain secret knowledge. This was the beginning of a movement called Gnosticism. And if you don't know anything about that, and if you're not curious about that, no problem. But simply put, it was the idea that if you could call on certain stars and constellations, not in the sense of them being like physical things, but in terms of them inhabiting certain spirits and principalities, then you could have secret knowledge to be able to command things and to be able to do almost spells and conjuring and all these things. And Paul says, dude, you don't need any of that stuff. In Christ dwells all the fullness. That's all you need. And so anytime someone comes to you and says, I got the secret, you say, you know what? I don't know about you, but this isn't secret. This is all I need to know because this tells me about Jesus. And if this tells me about Jesus, then all the fullness of God dwells in Jesus, and therefore I don't need your secret. But there was a sense in which, about 10, 15 years ago, when the secret came out, remember like Oprah was obsessed with this, and like, you know, all these people were like, yeah, you can like totally get like a big bank account if you just call on these things and believe in it. There was a sense in which even Christians were led away by this stuff. I'm not kidding. If you look on Amazon and you just type in like secret or mystery or church, you're going to get like hundreds of thousands of results. By the way, that's a good business idea. Write a book like The Secret, and you'll sell millions of copies, I'm convinced. But brothers and sisters, I'm so concerned because the book of Revelation, like the title even, it means unveiling. Not only that, but when Jesus died on the cross, there were several things that happened. One of the most prominent being that the veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom, indicating that it wasn't a man who did it, but rather God who did this. And what the veil being rent, what that indicated was that the Holy of Holies was now going to seep out, and the blessing from the holy place would come out and would start infecting the rest of the people. What does that mean? Well, if you were a first century Jew, you did not go to the temple. Like, you did not go inside of the Holy of Holies, I should say. Like, who's the only person who did that once a year? The high priest. But what God is saying is, guess what? Now that Jesus is on the scene, we don't need that stuff anymore. It's all in Jesus. And so there is no more need for secrets. So that the church, even though it would meet at the temple like porch, it never met inside of the temple, because inside the temple, there were things done for the people. But now there were churches and synagogues that were set up where no one needed to come in because of secret things. It was simply because they would allow people to participate in a public demonstration of what God had done for them. We need to hurry up. You guys are talking too much. All right. Three, don't misinterpret success for God's blessing. So Jezebel, she might look convincing. She might look successful. I know there are some pastors who can pack out baseball stadiums for their service. But I wouldn't want to be them on Judgment Day. So don't confuse success with God's blessing. Instead, one of the characteristics and attributes of God is that he's long-suffering. And so whenever we see someone who's in sin and they seem to be prospering, that's not God saying, oh, I love what you're doing. Bless you, bless you. That is God's long-suffering, because he's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to them. And moreover, sometimes it's God's wrath, because God's just saying, my hands is off you. So don't misinterpret success for God's blessing. That's what happened in the book of Revelation. They were hardworking, and Jezebel, the spirit of Jezebel gave them success, but they weren't doing the right things. And finally, I'm sorry, it says a 3 here, it should say 4, but finally, don't complicate your faith. Jesus says to them, in the way that he wants them to repent, to you I say, I do not lay on you any other burden. Only hold fast to what you have until I come. And this is, if I could impart any part of this to you, it's simply this, brothers and sisters. We just need to return to the simplicity of the gospel. I'm an old football coach at heart. I coached football for 2 years and I loved it. And anytime, mid-season, something broke down, you know what we could trace it down to? The fundamentals. The fundamentals broke down. You didn't do what you were taught day one. day 300, day 5,000. If you don't do what you're taught on day 1, the breakdown in fundamentals will contribute to you losing. So, I leave you with this excellent example. KISS. Don't literally kiss, Phil, but the acronym. I'm just kidding. I love you, Phil. He just loves when I call him in anyways. Keep it simple, smarty, is what that stands for. Keep it simple. Karl Barth is the author of the several books, but he wrote something called the Church Dogmatics. It's this prolific volume, massive, several volumes rather, of theology. I don't agree with a lot of it, but he was a genius. And he was interviewed, he's a German theologian, he was interviewed, and someone asked him, Dr. Barth, what is the most important thing you've learned after making this magnum opus, this magnificent contribution? What's the biggest thing you've learned? He said this: Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Did he need to write all those books to discover that? No. But we always need to remember it. And sometimes we need to be reminded more than we need to be instructed. And with that, let's go ahead and pray. Let's ask God to help us to return to the fundamentals. We're going to have one final song. Annika is going to come up here and lead us in one final song. But let's have this time of reflection. Really dwell on our hearts so that we can return to those fundamentals. And remember that it's all about God. It's all about Jesus. He is everything that we need. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for this opportunity. And I ask, God, that you would be receiving the praises of your people right now. Lord, where we have complicated things, help us to get back to the basics. Where we have made grievous errors, help us to repent. Where we have missed it, help us to be discerning. God, we don't want to just be a hard-working church. We want to be a hard-working church that does things for you. So help us not to get off on the wrong foot. Lord, thank you for this time of worship reflection. We ask your blessing on this time. In Jesus' name, amen.